Nothing exploded. No emergency meeting was announced. No markets were halted. And yet something shifted the moment he spoke. This didn't begin with a document dump or an international press conference. It began with a statement, a controlled one, delivered calmly, almost casually, but the content behind it was anything but normal. When Nicolas Maduro decided to speak publicly about a leaked list, he wasn't just making an accusation. He was breaking a rule that usually governs moments like this: silence. Because in geopolitics, silence is rarely emptiness. Silence is negotiation. Silence is pressure. Silence is waiting. And when someone breaks that silence, it's usually not by accident. According to Maduro, a list exists. A list of U.S. insiders allegedly helping China through indirect channels, not spies in trench coats, not dramatic defections, but facilitators, connectors, people positioned close enough to the system to understand how to move around it. What matters here is not whether every name is real. What matters is that the claim itself landed without immediate denial, without a coordinated rebuttal, without the kind of reaction you would expect if this were obviously absurd, and that alone tells us something important. Because in a world where misinformation spreads instantly, false claims usually die fast. They are mocked, dismantled, or aggressively countered. This one didn't. It lingered. Why? To understand that, we need to step back and look at the timing. This didn't come during a hot conflict. It didn't follow a major sanctions announcement. It didn't coincide with a financial crash. It came during calm. Markets were open. Trade routes were functioning. Diplomacy appeared stable on the surface. And that's exactly why this matters. In the modern system, the most disruptive moves rarely happen during chaos. They happen during normality, when attention is low and defenses are relaxed. Maduro didn't shout, bro. He didn't threaten. He didn't escalate militarily. He talked. And by doing so, he introduced doubt into a space that depends entirely on trust. Trust that systems are clean. Trust that alliances are clear. Trust that lines are still solid. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Global systems today don't break along clean lines. They bend, they reroute, they adapt. The idea that insiders might quietly facilitate alternative flows between rival powers doesn't sound shocking anymore. It sounds plausible, and that's new. 10 years ago, this kind of claim would have been dismissed outright. Today, it fits a pattern where pressure doesn't cause collapse. It causes workarounds. Sanctions don't stop trade, they redirect it. Restrictions don't end access, they complicate it. Walls don't block movement, they create tunnels. So when Maduro speaks about insiders helping China, he's not just pointing fingers outward. He's highlighting a weakness inside the system itself. A system that has grown so complex that loyalty is no longer ideological. It's procedural. People don't betray systems anymore, they navigate them, and that's the shift most people miss. This is not a story about good actors versus bad actors. It's about incentives, about pressure, about what happens when global power structures become too rigid to function openly. The question is not who is guilty. The question is, why does this feel believable now? Because if this list had no grounding at all, it would have collapsed under its own weight. Instead, it sparked quiet analysis, private discussions, careful wording, no panic, no outrage, just processing. And when the world responds to an allegation like this with silence instead of shock, it signals something deeper. It suggests the system is already tired. In the next part, we're going to look closely at what this so-called list actually represents, not as evidence, but as a signal of how power really moves today, and why leaks like this are becoming more common in an era where nothing officially breaks, but everything quietly changes. At first glance, the word list triggers a very specific reaction. People imagine names, faces, clear accusations, guilt or innocence. But that instinct is outdated. In today's geopolitical environment, lists are rarely about individuals. They are about access. What Maduro described was not a criminal indictment. It wasn't accompanied by evidence packages, sealed files, or formal charges. And that's important, because this wasn't meant to function as a legal move. It was a narrative move, a signal. Modern power doesn't operate through courtroom drama. It operates through infrastructure, logistics, and permissions. through who can approve what, who can delay something, who knows which door is unlocked. That's what a list like this implies. Not betrayal in the cinematic sense, but proximity. Insiders are not necessarily loyal to one flag or another. They are loyal to continuity, to keeping systems running, to maintaining flows under pressure. And pressure is exactly what the global system is under right now. When sanctions multiply, when trade routes tighten, when currencies strain, the system does not pause and ask moral questions. It adapts, quietly. An adaptation always needs facilitators. This is where most coverage gets it wrong. They frame these situations as exposure, as revelation, as if something hidden suddenly came into the light, but in reality, nothing was truly hidden. These gray zones have existed for years. The only difference now is that they are being named out loud. A list, in this context, doesn't say these people committed crimes. It says these pathways exist, and that changes how we should interpret it. Because if the list were entirely fictional, it would fail to resonate. Instead, it aligned with what many already suspect, that beneath official policy there is a second layer of operation focused on damage control. Not ideology, not allegiance, just function. This is especially true when dealing with global powers like China. China doesn't need dramatic defections. It needs continuity of supply, predictable access, reliable intermediaries who understand Western systems well enough to move around friction points. That doesn't require spies. It requires experience. People who know how regulations work, people who understand timing, people who can translate pressure into paperwork. And those people exist in every system. This is why accusations like these don't land as explosions. They land as confirmations of something uncomfortable but familiar. It also explains why the reaction from the US side tends to be measured. Overreaction would draw attention to a mechanism everyone quietly relies on. Silence, in this case, is safer. Because once you acknowledge the existence of these gray zones, you're forced to confront a larger truth. The system is no longer governed purely by declared rules. It's governed by exceptions, temporary measures that never end, emergency pathways that become permanent, unofficial practices that quietly stabilize what official policy destabilizes. So when Maduro talks about a list, he's not accusing individuals of betrayal. He's exposing the scaffolding holding the system together under strain, and that scaffolding is not designed to be seen. This is why the story matters even if every name on that list remains unverified. The message isn't, look who did this. The message is, look at what exists. And once you see that, it becomes harder to unsee. In the next part, we're going to examine why China fits so naturally into this picture, why Venezuela becomes a strategic node rather than a rogue state, and why these connections don't signal chaos, but coordination under pressure. There is a misconception that leaks exist to reveal truth. In reality, the most effective leaks are not designed to prove anything. They are designed to change behavior. A true exposure demands evidence, verification, confrontation. It forces institutions to react publicly. But a strategic leak does the opposite. It introduces uncertainty and then steps back. It lets the system react to itself. This is why lists like the one Maduro mentioned are so powerful. They don't accuse in a legal sense. They suggest in a psychological one. And suggestion is enough. Once an allegation enters the system, even without confirmation, it triggers internal recalculation. People become cautious, decisions slow down, communication becomes filtered. Not because someone is guilty, but because no one wants to be associated with risk. This is how power quietly shifts. A leak doesn't need to be accurate to be effective. It only needs to be plausible within the existing climate. And today's climate is already primed for suspicion. Institutions know they are operating under strain. They know public trust is thinner than it used to be. That makes them vulnerable to narratives that imply internal contradiction. So instead of denying loudly, they absorb quietly. They adjust posture. They reduce exposure. They delay responses. From the outside, it looks like calm. From the inside, it feels like friction. This is why modern geopolitical leaks rarely come with follow-ups. No documents, no prosecutions, no escalation. The leak already did its job. It forced the system to account for a version of reality it cannot fully reject. And once that happens, behavior changes even if policy doesn't. That's the distinction most people miss. Policies remain intact. Behavior adapts underneath. And adaptation is where long-term shifts actually occur. To understand why China appears at the center of this story, you have to forget headlines and focus on mechanics. China doesn't operate through sudden moves. It operates through patience, through planning, through building parallel systems that don't challenge the existing order directly, but slowly reduce dependence on it. That's why the idea of insiders helping China doesn't require espionage. It requires alignment of incentives. China's core challenge today is not access to markets. It's access to stability, stable supply chains, stable flows of energy, minerals, and strategic materials. And stability becomes harder when traditional routes are under constant political pressure. So what does a system under pressure do? It reroutes. This is where countries like Venezuela enter the picture, not as isolated actors, but as nodes. Venezuela sits at a unique intersection: energy reserves, strategic geography, a long history of sanctions pressure. That combination forces creativity. When formal channels close, informal ones expand, and those channels don't exist outside the system. They exist within it. This is the uncomfortable part. For China, working through intermediaries isn't about secrecy. It's about insulation, about ensuring that disruptions in one corridor don't ripple across the entire structure. For Venezuela, participation isn't ideological loyalty. It's survival. Sanctions don't eliminate trade needs. They increase the cost of ignoring them. So you get a convergence of interests. China needs alternative access. Venezuela needs economic oxygen. And the global system needs continuity. That last part is often ignored. Global markets are built on the assumption that flows continue, even during conflict. When that assumption is threatened, the system compensates in quiet ways. That's where insiders matter. Not because they betray, but because they understand the system well enough to bend it without breaking it. And bending is preferable. Breaking draws attention. Breaking triggers responses. Bending allows deniability. This is why the idea of a US-China shadow connection doesn't sound shocking anymore. It sounds like risk management. You don't need official approval for that. You need ambiguity. Ambiguity creates space. It allows governments to maintain public positions while quietly tolerating adjustments beneath the surface. This isn't conspiracy. It's how complex systems survive prolonged stress. China understands this better than most. Rather than confronting pressure head-on, it absorbs it, redirects it, and diffuses it across multiple pathways. That requires cooperation, sometimes from unexpected places. And when that cooperation becomes visible, even briefly, it feels jarring. Not because it's new, but because it contradicts the simplified narratives we're used to. So when Maduro speaks about insiders helping China, the deeper story isn't betrayal, it's coexistence. A world where rivalry and cooperation happen simultaneously, where public rhetoric and private logistics diverge. This is why these leaks are so destabilizing. They don't expose a crime. They expose a contradiction. And contradictions are harder to manage than enemies. In the next part, we'll bring this back home. We'll look at what this kind of allegation does to trust inside the United States itself, how it affects institutions, and why the real impact of this story isn't external but internal. The global system does not survive on clarity. It survives on gray zones. Between what is legal and what is illegal, there is a vast space where most real-world operations take place, especially under pressure. These zones are not secret. They are tolerated. They exist because strict enforcement would break continuity. And continuity is the system's highest priority. Trade, finance, logistics, energy. None of these can simply stop without consequences far worse than bending the rules. So systems bend. They create intermediaries. They rely on third parties. They route flows through countries that are neither allies nor enemies, but functional bridges. This is where stories like this one actually live, not in espionage agencies or shadow councils, but in paperwork, shipping routes, financial instruments, and regulatory loopholes. Gray zones are not evidence of corruption. They are evidence of survival. When pressure increases, reliance on these zones grows. And when reliance grows, so does the risk of exposure. That's why moments like this feel destabilizing. They don't reveal something new. They remind people of something uncomfortable, that the system they trust is held together by compromises they never see. And once those compromises are named, even vaguely, the illusion of clean separation collapses. Friend versus enemy. legal versus illegal, official versus unofficial. Those lines blur. This doesn't mean chaos is coming, it means complexity is no longer hidden. And when complexity becomes visible, trust becomes harder to maintain. That's the real tension behind this story, not betrayal, not conspiracy, but a system stretched so far that its invisible supports begin to show. The most important effects of stories like this are rarely external. They don't destabilize rival governments first. They destabilize trust at home. When allegations point inward, toward insiders, the damage isn't about guilt. It's about doubt. Doubt spreads quietly. People begin to question whether institutions are still aligned with the public narrative, whether decisions are being made for national interest or for systemic convenience. And that kind of doubt doesn't need confirmation to take root. That's what makes it powerful. In the United States, institutions depend heavily on perceived integrity. The system functions because people assume rules are enforced consistently, loyalties are clear, and boundaries exist. When a story suggests that boundaries are porous, even hypothetically, it erodes that assumption, not dramatically. Gradually, no protests, no breakdown, just a subtle recalibration of trust. This is why official responses to these situations are often minimal. Strong denials amplify attention. Investigations raise questions. Silence keeps the system stable, but silence has a cost. It creates a vacuum where interpretation fills the gap. Analysts speculate, commentators connect dots, audiences draw their own conclusions. And once that process starts, it's hard to reverse. What's happening here is not a scandal cycle, it's a normalization cycle. The idea that insiders might facilitate alternative outcomes becomes part of the background noise. It stops feeling exceptional. That's dangerous. Because systems don't collapse when people are angry. They collapse when people stop believing explanations. When trust fades, institutions compensate by relying more on technical language, more on complexity, more on distance from the public. And that creates a feedback loop. Less trust leads to less transparency. Less transparency leads to more suspicion. More suspicion leads to more silence. This is how stability slowly turns brittle. The irony is that none of this requires wrongdoing to be real. The perception alone reshapes behavior. Officials become more cautious. Communication becomes more filtered. Decision-making moves further behind closed doors. The system adapts to protect itself, and adaptation, again, replaces correction. So when you hear a story like this framed as an external threat, that framing misses the point. The real impact is internal. It tests how resilient trust actually is. Can institutions absorb ambiguity without cracking? Can public confidence survive unanswered questions? Can silence still function as a stabilizer? These are not theoretical questions anymore. They're being answered in real time. And the answers aren't loud. They're subtle. They show up in language, in tone, in the way officials choose what not to address. By the time consequences become visible, the shift has already happened. In the final part, we'll step back and look at what this moment represents in a broader sense. Not just this leak, not just this accusation, but what it tells us about the phase the global system has entered, and why moments like this are becoming more frequent. When someone speaks at the wrong moment, it's usually a mistake. When someone speaks at the perfect moment, it's rarely accidental. This was not a leak designed to cause chaos. It was a message designed to test tolerance. Tolerance for ambiguity. Tolerance for contradiction. Tolerance for systems that no longer function by their own stated rules. The most important detail in this entire story is not the list itself, it's the reaction to it. There was no shockwave, no sudden rupture, no emergency response, just absorption. And that tells us exactly what phase the global system is in. We are no longer in an era where crises announce themselves. We are in an era where systems adjust quietly and hope no one notices. Pressure doesn't produce collapse anymore. It produces adaptation. Rules bend, exceptions multiply, language softens, and power continues to move just through less visible channels. This is why moments like this are becoming more common, not because the world is more unstable, but because instability has been normalized. A leak doesn't need to prove anything. It only needs to feel plausible. Once plausibility exists, behavior changes. Governments become more cautious. Institutions become more defensive. Public narratives become more carefully engineered. The system learns. and learning is not the same as healing. What makes this dangerous is that nothing appears broken. Markets open, trade continues, diplomacy functions, but beneath that surface, trust is thinner, lines are blurrier, and the distance between official story and operational reality keeps growing. This is not a warning about one country or one leader or one accusation. It's a warning about the phase we've entered, a phase where power prefers silence to confrontation, where adaptation replaces accountability, where stability is maintained by avoiding questions, not answering them. When Maduro spoke, he didn't trigger a crisis. He measured one. He measured how much uncertainty the system could absorb without reacting, and the answer came back quietly. A lot. And that may be the most unsettling part of all, because systems don't fail when they're tested and break. They fail when they're tested and no longer respond.